California, September 16th, 2003. Riverside Sheriff's Department received reports of a body in a pickup truck just outside the city of Paris.
I heard the call go out, a dead body in a vehicle in the area of Markham and Indian Avenue.
There were at least 35 stab wounds on the victim. That's overkill. And usually overkill is a personal thing.
The victim is 40-year-old construction worker Tomas de la Riva, who was last seen leaving for work with his teenage nephew, Hugo.
Hugo and Thomas left for work about 3:30 in the morning. The truck broke down, and Thomas stayed at the truck.
Police begin to question onlookers who have gathered at the scene.
And I'm thinking, who found this guy? And it's like, well, the wife found him. I just thought it was kind of strange.
Further investigation throws up more questions for detectives as they uncover a secret love triangle involving the victim.
I guess love does crazy things to people. And you throw in sex and it really, really makes them do some crazy things.
Jealousy can go a long way to help people commit crimes, even murder.
The city of Paris in Riverside County, California, is located 70 miles east of Los Angeles.
When I first started, it was still an agricultural area, basically. It was a lot of wheat and barley and livestock out here. But now it's hugely grown. It's a lot of industry, a lot of homes.
In 2003, Paris had a very high crime rate. Back then, it was kind of a corridor for drug trafficking coming up from Mexico and then throughout the United States. It's improved quite a bit since then.
Riverside at the time was like the Wild West. It was away from the major cities of Los Angeles, San Diego, Orange County.
Predominantly Hispanic and black at the time. As you go north into the county areas, then the white population is a little more dispersed.
On the morning of September 16th, 2003, officers from Riverside Sheriff's Department receive a 911 call. A body has been discovered on the outskirts of Paris.
They notified us around 8:30, 8:35. We got there maybe 20 minutes later.
I was actually driving into the office, and I got a call from the sergeant, said, hey, we have a homicide in the rural area of Paris. I need you to respond out there.
Officers arrive at the scene and find a crowd has already gathered.
I've been to a lot of homicides, and there was something different about this scene. When I got there, it was just a lot of people just close around where the body was. We need to get these people out of here.
It's an industrial complex. There's no real residences around there. It's all industrial buildings.
There was a red Dodge pickup truck parked behind the trees off the road, and that's where the body was located.
Directly across the street from it was a concrete manufacturing facility. Somebody from the concrete facility heard a woman screaming. Quite a few people from the concrete plant walked across the street, and they discovered that the victim was deceased in the truck.
Investigators move the crowd back and begin assessing the scene.
There would be a briefing once the homicide unit got there. All the facts that have been developed probably up to that point to give the homicide guys and girls something to go with. So they have an idea of what's going on.
And then from there, we got assignments. We had case agents and then a scene person.
I received a phone call from Riverside Sheriff Department. They were at the scene of a death and requested I respond.
You got to consider everything as evidence. You get pretty much one opportunity to go through and collect that evidence.
As we walked in and do our walkthrough, I saw a red truck on the side of the road. The door was open, and I saw a deceased male on the floor, covered in blood.
There was a body that looked like a Hispanic male with his head kind of at the passenger door area and his feet towards the driver's side or where the gas and foot pedals would be.
He was laying face down, knees up to his chest, on the floorboard of the vehicle.
There was a large amount of blood that was obviously visible, and it looked fresh, like it had just happened or fairly recently.
The victim is 40-year-old construction worker Tomas de Riva.
We removed the clothing for protection so they could examine it closely later, and we did notice that there was considerable wounds on his back and front, face, neck, hands, torso. They located a knife and a cigarette lighter in the ground next to the driver's door of the truck.
We took our scene photographs, and then we walked out of the scene, and then said, okay, we need to start interviewing some people.
I assigned a deputy to take a digital camera and photograph every person that was anywhere near the crime scene. And then we also had them photograph the actual sole of their shoes because they had been walking around, so we could try to match shoe prints and shoe impressions from around the area of the truck.
Investigators quickly learn that some of the victim's close relatives are nearby.
Some of the family members, including the wife, were at the scene.
Since it was Spanish speaking, I was assigned to do the translation and do all the interviews in Spanish.
Our interviews, we always like to conduct them in a formal setting. And eventually they always do get to a formal setting, but it might be something as simple initially as a field interview, just to get some information.
Officers now learn that it was Tomas's wife, Maria de Riva, and her sister, Sylvia Reyes, who discovered Tomas's truck that morning and made the 911 call.
And I asked Maria, what happened to your husband? And she said, well, he left and didn't come back, and I don't know what happened to him. And then, I went looking for him, and I found him.
Around 6 a.m., she and her sister, Sylvia, left for work, and she tells her sister that Thomas's truck had broken down when he left for work earlier that morning, and that she was concerned something had happened to him. They decided to go looking for him. Sometime between 7 and 8 a.m. that day, they find his truck, and they find Mr. De La Riva on his stomach on the floor of the truck. He had been stabbed 33 times.
It was the wife that was the one that was screaming that got the attention of the people from the concrete factory next door.
Detectives invite Maria and Sylvia back to the station for a formal interview, hoping to understand more about Tomas and his last known movements.
After her initial interview, I actually transported the wife of the victim back to our station, and she was interviewed by Detective Masson.
I said, are you involved in any way in the demise of your husband? And no, okay. He went to work with Hugo, my nephew, through marriage. My husband usually takes him to work.
Tomas de Riva's nephew Hugo traveled from Mexico to the United States 1 year earlier and was living with Tomas, his wife Maria, and their children.
Hugo eventually showed back up at the house, but without the victim. Hugo stated that the truck broke down and that his uncle was left there with the truck, and Hugo walked back to the house.
A short time later, Hugo returns home and informs Tomas's wife, Maria de Riva, that their truck broke down and he needs water to fix it.
He came back, he said the car overheated, got 3 bottles of water, and he left. And then from there, he called and said, hey, I can't find him. Uncle Tomas is not there anymore, and he probably went to another family member's house, but I have to go to work. So he went off to a relative named Aaron, who took him to Orange County to work.
Hugo's boss is Maria de Riva's brother, Aaron Reyes.
We knew that Hugo was the last person to see the victim alive.
Aaron and Hugo are together, and I said, well, they need to come back. We need to talk to them.
So we called Hugo's boss in Orange County and asked if Hugo would be willing to come back and meet with us.
Aaron drives Hugo back from Orange County to the police station in Paris.
I talked to Aaron before I talked to Hugo, and he's like, I brought him back, and he's waiting for you guys. We need to find out exactly what's going on here.
Officers hope that Hugo can assist them with their investigation.
I bring Hugo into the interview room and I ask him, what happened? And he goes, well, I woke up early. My uncle always takes me over to Aaron's house to drive off to work. And then what happened to that? He goes, well, we were driving to Aaron's house. The car overheated. Where did it overheat at? It overheated at Wilson. Would you be able to take us to there? It shows where, oh, sure, I'll take you guys. So at that time, we get in the car with Hugo, and he takes us down to the location. And he says, well, this is where the car overheated. There was some scuff marks where the tires like that. So that's all consistent with what he told us. And where do you think your uncle went after that? I don't know. What'd you do? He goes, well, I went home to get some water. Okay. And did you see anyone? Well, I saw my nephew, Esteban, who eventually ended up giving me a ride back to Aaron's house to take me to work because we couldn't find my uncle. I said, okay. So we take him back to the station. We put him in the interview room now.
Hugo's uncle Aaron now reveals some important information to investigators.
Aaron comes up to me and says, hey, I just want to let you know, when we told him that his body was found, there was no reaction. There's something going on here. I'm like, okay. And he goes, also, I just want to let you know that Hugo and Maria were having some type of sexual relationship.
They were having an affair right underneath his uncle's eyes, and he was aware of the affair. It was no secret.
This startling new piece of information about Hugo's affair with his aunt Maria gives police their first serious lead in their investigation into the brutal murder of Tomas de la Riva. September 16th, 2003, Riverside County, California. The bloodied body of construction worker Tomas de la Riva is discovered in his red pickup truck on the outskirts of the city of Paris. Tomas left his home earlier that morning to go to work with his nephew Hugo de la Riva, who was living with Tomas and his family at the time. Detectives have discovered Hugo has been having an affair with his aunt Maria.
We found out that there was a secretive relationship that was going on the side behind the victim's back.
Talked to Hugo. I have no idea what happened to my uncle. Last time I saw him, he was alive, was waiting for me. He probably went to a relative's house. Well, what relative do you have around there? Well, I don't know. Maybe it was one of his relatives. Well, wouldn't one of his relatives be one of your relatives? Now he's getting a little frustrated. The answer he's giving me is not matching. He still sticks with the story. I have no idea.
The interview with Hugo is suddenly interrupted by an unexpected development.
After the initial interview with Maria, Detective Masson asked for somebody to sit in the room with her. While that officer was sitting in the room with her, she began to make some spontaneous statements. And so the officer came to me and I notified Detective Masson.
Maria wants to talk to you. She's saying that he came back and he raped her in a room.
Maria's serious accusation against Hugo changes the attitude of the investigators.
Like, sit down with Maria and tell me exactly what happened when he came home. Well, he came home, I was in my room, and he came in, he was completely naked. Did he have any blood on him or anything? Well, he was washing his clothes. How about his boots? And she said, well, he washed his boots outside.
But inconsistencies in Maria's story begin to raise doubts in the minds of the investigators.
She's all over the place. Her story just doesn't match. She's telling me details where the boots are. She's probably there watching them. There's something going on. And I asked her, do you think Hugo had something to do with the demise of your husband? And she says, I think he did. I said, well, why would you? Well, we've been having a sexual relationship for a long time. I said, I'm going to take you back, have you sit with your family. Please don't discuss anything with anyone.
Her story didn't appear to match kind of what was going on with the whole totality of the evidence that we had there, and things were just a little bit off.
From there, I go back into the interview room with Hugo. And I say, I think we have a little issue here. Have you been having a relationship with your aunt? And he kind of looks at me and says, yeah, we have. Why didn't you tell me that before? And he's like, well, I didn't think it was important. He starts kind of backpedaling a little bit. And I'm like, well, it is important. Honestly, I don't think what happened this morning is what you're telling me.
The tone of questioning now takes a dramatic turn in an attempt by investigators to find out what happened in the hours and days prior to the fatal attack on Tomas.
I'm letting him tell me a story because some of the story's true that he's telling me. Other parts, it's not. But, it's his story.
You want to kind of make him at ease, and then at some point you are going to transition into a serious interrogation and at some point get accusatory and try to elicit information with the facts that you've developed up to that point.
Eventually, I start breaking him down where I had to read him his Miranda rights. He waived his rights and wanted to talk to me.
Hugo tells investigators about the abusive and violent relationship between his uncle and aunt and how it sparked the idea of murdering Tomas.
He came up with the story that, yes, they were having a sexual relationship. He hated his uncle because he would beat the kids and would beat Maria. He just didn't like that. And him and Maria got really close, and that's how they started the relationship. And, Maria wanted me to kill him.
There had been this plan or this scheme to murder her husband so that they could be together.
She'd get an argument with her husband, Tomas, and then she'd come back and tell him, let's kill him. And then, of course, Hugh would get all excited. They would have sex, and after sex, she would say, something, why don't we just hold off on that for another day? The cycle would start again. And this goes on for a long time.
Enraged by a feeling of helplessness, Hugo now makes a fateful decision that will change everyone's lives.
Hugo finally gets to the point where he's like, I'm just going to kill him. And she's like, well, if you're going to kill him, you do it. Keep me out of it. Don't get me involved. Well, I think it's a little too late for that.
Hugo explains to investigators the planning that went into killing his uncle.
Hugo told investigators that he had asked to borrow $1,500 from Maria and that Tomas wouldn't notice that the money was gone and that she gave him the money and that he used this money to pay a guy named Armando to kill Tomas.
Even in today's world, the hiring of a hitman is very rare. And $1,500, even in 2003 money, that's pretty cheap.
He describes Armando. He says Armando's the one who stabbed him. He's the one that did everything, not me. I was there.
Hugo's in the front seat, and this Armando guy is in the back seat behind Tomas, who was driving. While they're driving, they stop on Wilson. Armando wraps a cord around Thomas's neck and strangles him and starts stabbing him.
Well, what's your uncle doing? My uncle's screaming out, Hugo, help me, Hugo, help me. Car comes to a stop. I get out of the truck, and I go around, but it's too late. My uncle's dead. And what do? Well, I just go home. He's describing how his uncle's being stabbed consisted of him stabbing his uncle.
Then Hugo tells the investigator after he leaves and walks back home, Armando drives off in the vehicle with the victim.
Hugo's startling account of Tomas's murder stuns investigators, but more unexpected revelations quickly follow.
By that time, I'm getting pagers. I come out of the room. So I come out of the room, and they're like, hey, go talk to Maria again. She wants to tell you some more.
Suspicion now falls on Maria de la Riva and her role in the murder of her husband, Tomas.
I need to put Maria in an interview room because she's a suspect now. So I get her in an interview room, and I said, Maria, I need to read your rights. She waives her rights, and she tells me a story about, yeah, we've been in a relationship, but I do love my husband. We have kids together and the whole thing, but we just don't have a good relationship. And I confide in Hugo, and that's how our relationship started. So she tells me everything, the thing leading up to that morning.
Maria now gives a different version of events of what happened earlier that morning.
I woke him up to go to work, and the last thing I told Hugo was, don't do nothing to him. I don't want to get involved. She's minimizing a little bit, not probably telling us the truth because she knew what was going on. She sends him off to work. She goes back to bed, knowing that her husband's going to get killed.
A short while later, Hugo returns to the house and wakes Maria.
He comes back, he's naked, and he jumps on top of me and takes my clothes off. What are you wearing? I said, well, I'm wearing my shorts. What happened after that? He just got up and called Esteban to take him over to Aaron's house.
Maria's clothing also raises the suspicions of the officers.
She's in a sweatsuit. I asked Maria, where's your shorts? You told me you were in shorts this morning. Well, I took them off after we made love. There's a big difference between sex and love.
More information about the troubled family dynamic emerges from an unlikely source. Maria's sister Sylvia now asks to speak to investigators.
I said, Sylvia, I was told that you want to talk to me. She goes, yeah, I think my sister and Hugo were involved in the death of her husband. I'm like, okay, well, what makes you think that? She goes, they've been having an affair for a long time. I said, well, how do you know? She said, well, Maria told me. How about Tomas? Does he know? She goes, well, I was at a quinceanera, which is a Sweet 15 type party, and I confided to Tomas, and I said, hey, just to let you know, Hugo and Maria are having a sexual relationship. And Tomas says, I know they've been having it, and I told him to break it off, but I'm afraid if they leave, the kids are going to leave, she's going to leave, and, I'm left here by myself. So I just kind of left it alone.
Investigators are getting closer to finding out what really happened earlier that morning to Tomas de Riva, but many questions remain unanswered.
Once they told me the whole story, I went back to Hugo and I said, okay, Hugo, we got some serious problems here. I don't think there's Armando. I think you're the one who probably stabbed your uncle to death. So he kind of breaks down a little bit. I hate him. He beat the kids, he beat her, and, but it wasn't me. I was there. It wasn't me.
Hugo now accuses Maria of paying for the murder of her husband, Tomas de Riva.
She gave me $1,500, and we were planning to use that money to give to Armando to kill my uncle. Well, where's the money at? Well, my car got towed. It got impounded because I didn't have a license. I'm like, okay, you're telling me all this stuff, but did you give the money to Armando? I said, well, I approached Armando a long time ago, and he said, yes, I'll kill him, but it'll cost you $1,500. So I was giving him $50 here, $25 here, and I'm thinking, buddy, that doesn't make sense. Are we going to find Armando? Well, yes, you are.
Investigators must now find Armando and establish his role in the murder of Tomas de Riva. Perris, Riverside County, California. 40-year-old construction worker Tomas de Riva has been found murdered in his pickup truck by the side of the road. Detectives have uncovered an affair between his wife Maria and his teenage nephew Hugo. Hugo has admitted to planning his uncle's murder with a man called Armando.
Homicide detectives transported Hugo to a location where Hugo identified where Armando lived. We arrived out at that scene. One of the deputy district attorneys went with us. We froze the residence in anticipation of getting a warrant for it.
We talked to the roommate that lived in the trailer with him. Oh, he left a couple of days. I haven't seen him in a couple of days, so that's kind of strange. I'm thinking, wait a minute.
We actually asked all the people that were at the house whether they'd be willing to come back to the Perris station to be interviewed, which they did. Armando was not identified as a suspect in this case.
Armando could have been just another person. He probably just threw the name out there.
With Armando now firmly ruled out as a suspect, investigators choose an unusual tactic to try and unravel the web of lies being spun by Hugo and Maria.
I go back to Hugo, and I say, you're pointing a finger at her, she's pointing a finger at you. You probably need to talk to Maria. You probably need to kind of set this straight. I went to Maria and I said, Hugo wants to talk to you. You okay with that? She goes, yeah, I want to talk to him. I'm fine with that.
Maybe something's just not clicking. We'll put those two people together in a room and they'll start talking, whispering, and that's being monitored.
I brought Hugo in and I said, Maria's sitting there. Hugo, I want you to sit over here. I don't want you guys walking towards each other. Please talk, but there's no touching.
And you're watching for just little things that are suspicious, and you use that information against them.
They start talking to each other. He tells Maria, why did you say everything? I was going to take the blame for it. And Maria's like, well, I told you not to do it. I told you not to get me involved. I told you not to do it. And they're talking details about the murder. Hugo, a couple times, got up and started walking towards her. Of course, I'm sitting there watching it. So I go in there and I kind of make it look like I'm not watching, because they don't know we're watching. Knock on the door. I go in and I'm like, I told you guys, I don't want you doing that. Getting close. I need you to sit here. I need you to sit over there. That's it. So I break them up and they start talking again. Hugo ended up wanting a hug from her, and obviously she didn't want nothing to do with him. That got close to the point we were able to break it up and put them back in their corners so they could talk again. And that went to the point where, okay, we got enough.
Investigators now believe they have enough evidence to arrest Hugo and Maria for the murder of Tomas de la Riva.
We told them, you're under arrest for the homicide of your husband, the homicide of your uncle.
You still have to corroborate that. You have to take your bits and pieces of evidence that you've developed, and you finally get to a point, it may not all be done, but you can see the picture, and you just take it from there.
I booked them into Robert Presley Detention Center, which is downtown Riverside. From there, they could have been moved anywhere within Riverside County.
With Hugo and Maria now in custody, investigators must gather all the evidence available to them to build the strongest possible case.
In Riverside County, when we have a homicide, we have a team of 5 people. You have a lead investigator, a case agent, you have someone who's going to process the scene, and then you have 2 extra investigators that will canvass or help process the scene also.
We had gone to Winchester for the original Armando search warrant. Then we also went to an address on Hennessy in the city of Paris, which is where Maria and the victim lived. Froze the location in anticipation of a search warrant.
I authored the search warrant. We went later on that day and processed the house with one of our forensic technicians.
Investigators conduct a detailed crime scene investigation of Tomas and Maria de la Riva's home to gather crucial evidence in the case.
I want to search Hugo's room. I want to search the room where apparently the rape occurred. I collected the shorts, the clothing in the washer, the boots that did have blood on them.
Another piece of evidence provides investigators with an insight into Hugo's mental state prior to the killing of his uncle.
Hugo had a drawing sketch of Maria on cardboard in his room.
Clearly, there was a lot of emotion, passion involved. She could have just said, hey, you're my nephew. I don't want nothing to do with you. Let's just break this off. This is not appropriate.
I think she played a critical role in it. Had it not been for her and her affair, the victim would probably be alive today.
Riverside County Coroner's Office now conducts a detailed autopsy of Tomas de la Riva's body as part of the investigation into his murder.
The deputy coroner, when he runs into a death of this nature, he carries that with him through other deaths and other situations. It both steadies himself and it gives him experience that say, hey, I saw this before. This happened in this case, and it matches exactly this case. We bring the body in, and the body's unclothed, photographed, washed front and back. If we need to, we do x-rays, provide those to the doctor doing the examination. Some start with the head, some start with the hands, but they examine everything.
The autopsy reveals the brutal injuries sustained by Tomas in the final moments of his life.
Generally, a report is maybe 1 or 2 pages. I think in this case, he wrote like 10 pages. There are several defensive marks on his hands where he tried to protect himself. injuries to his back, injuries to his head, injuries to his face. At one point, there's a pressure put on his neck, and we saw those by petechia in his eye, which is a hemorrhage in his eyes from that particular movement.
The high number of stab wounds found on Thomas's body indicates a personal connection between him and his killer.
Whenever you have knives and cutting edges, it becomes very personal.
An angry person wants them to be hurt, and this is what he was doing. A killer would just hit you once in the heart and you're dead, but that's something that's personal.
To be able to conjure up the ability or the courage to actually strangle somebody and watch the life just kind of slowly slip away from them, that's pretty personable.
Detective Masson identified Hugo and Maria as the suspects in this case.
Hugo and Maria della Riva are now formally charged with the murder of Tomas della Riva.
Both of them were charged with 187 of California Penal Code, which is murder.
September 2003. Maria della Riva and her nephew Hugo della Riva have been charged with the murder of Maria's husband, Tomas.
Maria initially denied knowing anything about how her husband was killed and why and who did it. But later she recanted and admitted that she had been having an affair with Hugo and that he had told her he wanted to kill Thomas.
She went along with him. She, at times, would approach him and say, I want you to kill him. She would turn him on, turn him off, turn him off, turn him on, to the point where Hugo said, hey, you know something? I just need to take care of this and do away with him.
He wanted Maria for himself. Probably didn't like the fact that husband and wife were still living and sleeping together.
Under police questioning, Hugo accuses his friend Armando of killing his uncle Tomas.
Hugo tells the investigator that he and Thomas and this Armando guy get in the truck. And as they're driving, Hugo's in the front seat, Thomas is driving. This Armando guy is supposedly sitting in the rear seat behind the driver, behind Thomas. As they come to a stop on Wilson, Armando, according to Hugo, wraps a cord around Thomas's neck and strangles him and then starts stabbing him.
Hugo and Maria are both charged with the murder of Tomas della Riva. They are detained and booked into the county jail while awaiting trial.
I did go see him one other time in the jail. We showed him a picture of Armando. We ended up identifying him. Is this him? He said, yeah, that's him. Okay, at least we have an identification of the guy.
But investigators quickly rule out this false lead and focus in on the real killers.
Armando was not ever a suspect.
To this day, I don't even know if they even found that guy. I don't even know if he was involved in that.
This inter-family crime of passion shocks a community familiar with violence and murder.
That relationship was going on for a long time. A lot of the family members knew that was going on. From what the family members told me during the investigation, Tomas knew that his wife was having a sexual relationship with the nephew.
But nobody could have predicted the shocking and deadly events this bizarre love affair would ultimately lead to.
People might think about doing certain things, but they don't carry through. And then there are those people that they think about it, they plan it, and then they carry through. They're willing to step over the edge. That's always a pretty crazy to think. How does one get to that level?
Family members knew the relationship was going on, but they didn't think it was going to go to that level of killing a family member.
The human heart can be a dangerous thing. You just never know in situations like this what can happen. Certainly the victim didn't know. And it does beg questions. Why would you continue associating with your nephew who's having an affair with your wife, you know about this.
Love is very strong, and he felt very strong about his wife and keeping the family together. At one time, Maria and Tomas probably did love each other. They had a good family, but over time, that deteriorated to the point where she relied on Hugo to comfort her, and that's how the relationship started.
Investigators continue building their case against Hugo and Maria de la Riva.
There's no doubt that Hugo was the guy who did the stabbing. Maria was not the actual person physically doing it, but this whole thing happened because of her relationship. She's the focal point.
Anytime you get a confession, it's good. I always liked not just having a confession, but have them reenact it. Tomas did reenact what happened in that cab of that truck. So I had a confession and I had reenactment from him. Maria just confessed, and that was it.
She knew of the plan, and she was a part of that plan it, and helped try to cover it up initially till all this evidence against him was exposed. There was really no more defending that they could do to protect themselves.
The district attorney makes the decision to hold a joint trial for Hugo and Maria.
Typical courtroom, you had one side of the family on one side, and then the other side you have the responding officers, myself, the interview, the forensic techs, the deputy coroner that went out there, a handful of witnesses, a couple family members that supports Hugo and Maria, and they keep them separated.
Prosecutors must establish a high degree of planning on the part of Hugo to ensure he faces the full force of the law.
Was the case premeditated? Clearly it was. Obviously, Hugo knew he was going to be getting his ride to work and had to pick a date and a time and a location where he ultimately committed the crime, and so that took a little bit of planning and preparation. Certainly did not appear to be anything that was spontaneous.
I don't think there were any signs or information where he was mistreated by his uncle or anything. When one is willing to murder a close family member that's always been good to you, I think that takes it to a whole different level.
The prosecution must also present a convincing case to the jury about Maria's involvement in the brutal murder of her husband, Tomas.
There were red flags from the very beginning. You just don't get that many homicides where the husband leaves to go to work and then somehow the wife shows up at the scene to discover this truck at a fairly remote location. How does she wind up there?
There's like an old saying that suspect returning to the crime scene, which happens frequently, and it's done in the hopes of maybe throwing off the investigation that, why would I show back up where my deceased husband's at? And this was one of those cases.
As the police, right, we have a threshold that we have to meet, which is the probable cause threshold to make these arrests. Obviously, the prosecution has a separate set that they need to evaluate the case with. Giving that much evidence that, hey, what have you told the police? What did you tell them? I think it kind of displays the level of guilt, right, and their participation in this crime.
The jury retires to deliberate the verdict in the case. They return to court and find both defendants guilty on all counts of the charges against them.
From the time the investigators picked up the case, the evidence led them right to the two suspects. They were both tried and convicted. It's about as strong a case of justice being served as we can expect under the circumstances and looking at the facts of the case.
When these cases are put together, they go to the district attorney and their chiefs. They have what's called a staffing, and they sit down and they discuss what is it that we can prove. Can we do the death penalty? Clearly, it was a first-degree murder, right? He could have been eligible for the death penalty.
Hugo de la Riva was sentenced to life without parole. Maria de la Riva was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison.
Maria just got 25 years to life. 25 years later, she would be eligible for parole.
For the Della Riva family, the pain and sadness of their loss will never heal.
It's sad. Family is left behind, children are left behind, without a father, without a mother, knowing what happened, that, mother was having a sexual relationship with a nephew, and the nephew ended up killing dad. The kids are old enough now that they probably know what happened. They were old enough then.
It's very odd to have a nephew having an affair with a married woman and then ultimately killing the husband.
But many questions remain for those left behind. And could a crime like this have been avoided?
He wanted her, and it came down to jealousy that I want Maria. I had to get rid of my uncle to be with Maria.
They wanted something, and they were so desperate for it that they were willing to commit a murder to be together.
How he would think that would happen, how he would think in his mind that this is going to work out, that, his uncle's going to be out of the picture and he's just going to take the place of his uncle with her, that's for him to tell you.
The thorough investigation by the homicide team ensures justice is served in this case.
It's just being tenacious about your investigation to really dig into the stories that they're giving you, and does it make sense? And if it doesn't make sense, then okay, we'll figure out why. Whether that's follow-up interviews, whether that's matching the evidence that's at the scene to what they're telling you.
The thing that stands out most are the number and severity of the injuries. It was a crime of passion, basically. That was their ace card. There's more to it than this, yeah.
To me, it was just kind of like, I'm just doing my job. I want to get as much as possible in there, because at the end of the day, I don't want something to say, well, we didn't do this, or this wasn't done, or we didn't get enough evidence on her. She was a victim of this, and obviously she was not.
I'm sure that his family is appreciative that the people responsible for this are spending time in prison.